Bienvenido, Power Bottoms. Welcome to a brand new Record Club episode of the Jams and Tea podcast, where we spin the jams and spill the tea. And this week, we're going to be talking about Saoirse's recommended record, The Life of the World, fucking whatever the fuck it's called. Tell us what the fucking record
It's God Forgive These Bastards, songs from the Forgotten Life of Henry Turner. This is, unsurprisingly for me, a folk punk record, but it's a bit more than that. Where to begin? First of all, in the Rate Your Music genre tags, it says it's a folk punk record and a punk rock record. That's all fine. It also says it's an avant-garde jazz record, so that needs to be flagged up right at the beginning. I spent most of my time with this record believing the fiction that it presents, which for most of the existence of this record, the band have played completely straight. It is an album. It is also a book, which I have read. And it's about this fictional, schizophrenic, homeless person who used to be a star high school pitcher in the baseball team, but through his addiction to meth, ruined a throw and tore his rotator cuff in his shoulder. It goes into much more detail in the book, which is about 100 pages, not very long. And basically, the band were very upfront about this being real until the reissue, where they said that actually we made it up. This Henry Turner is not real. But what they said, and this is actually in the coda of the book as well, written by the lead singer Rob Morton. He basically said that the reason they wanted to do it this way was because part of the artistic intent was to see how people would react to humanizing basically a domestic abuser and a murderer. Rob says in the book that what he wanted to do was basically say, is it possible and should we try to forgive people this terrible or find humanity in them? And he wanted to see if people would push back against this, or even if people would say that this is like poverty tourism from a band who were living at, the lead singer was living out of a shipment container when he wrote this record, so I don't know how valid those complaints would be. He wanted to see if those reactions would happen out of this record, and I think that's just really fucking interesting. And I think this record's interesting on a conceptual level. I think it's interesting on a music level, and I think a lot of the songs just fucking bang. And I want to hear what you guys think about it.
What this album is it's like a Tom Waits album, but if the singer was the dude from AJJ.
I'm so glad that I wasn't. I thought I was going to bring up a Tom Waits comparison, and everyone would be like, "Oh, he's bringing up Tom Waits again. Time to get the fucking sign." But like, this shit has Blood Money energy hard.
I think it welcomes it.
I thought about leveling a Mountain Goats comparison at this. So fucking
dude, one of my notes literally just sounds like this. The lead singer sounds like John Darnielle if he was screaming all the time.
Well, I refer you back to I refer you back to what I said, which is that it's like a Tom Waits record if it were fronted by the dude from AJJ. It has that very like scrappy sort of like folk punk emo sensibility to the performances, like vocal performances on this record, and it's like a real sort of strange sort of the instrumentation and the vocal performances are similarly chaotic in their own way, but together there's like a real strange sort of contrast in tonality and dynamics between them that makes it really sort of weird and confronting and strange to listen to. I will say I think this album is more interesting conceptually than in musical execution for the most part. That's my biggest sort of reservation here. But I do think that the musical execution itself is interesting and certainly unique. And there are particular tracks, I think, especially towards the beginning and the end of this record, it kind of loses me a little bit in some of the more sort of frenetic middle parts of it, although they can definitely add to the story. But there are parts towards the beginning and towards the end of this record where the real kind of vaudevillian sort of carnival-esque stylings of that folk punk template, and obviously it feels almost reductive to call it folk punk for reasons that Saoirse's already outlined, do give this thing a real sort of zing that I can't say I've gotten from most other records that, you know, are ostensibly in this vein. The vivid storytelling of the album is great. I like the way that there are these sort of varying perspectives across the record in terms of like who the songs are sung from the perspective of, and the way it kind of jumps around in both time and place in relation to this mythic Henry Turner figure himself. It does open with a song, As the Sun Beat Down, which kind of vividly and very kind of picturesquely describes his birth. And then there's one of the best songs on the album, Atlanta's Own, which I think is quite representative of what the album is musically, where the band do a great job of immersing you in the chaos of the day that Turner's baseball dreams are shattered. The detail is great. The back and forth vocals from the multiple vocalists on this song really, really work in setting a scene. And the intensity of the band is fantastic. It's one of those things where it's like these songs form a kind of patchwork as a totality of this kind of story of this person and their myth. But on an individual basis, kind of like don't really fit together, but like as a patchwork together, it kind of makes more sense. I will say that
I absolutely, just to leap on that, I absolutely think that's true of like the first half, and I view this as a record of two halves, like the first half is like reflecting on childhood memories, and the songs bleed together in the way memories do in that way. And it almost feels like this is like a meth-fueled mental spiral into the mistakes the character has made in a way. This is aided by the fact that some of the brass motifs recur across songs, as do some of the guitar riffs. And it just makes the first half also kaleidoscopic. And then the second half is much more calm. It's actually my preferred half, but I think they're both really great. And it's much more reflecting on the life he's currently leading in a way.
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely see that structure to it. And for the most part, I enjoy it quite a bit. What I will say is that the first few times I listened to this record, I had no idea the story was made up. I read the beautiful short story style description of it on the Bandcamp page, very vivid. I had no fucking clue that it was a fictional story. So that has made my relationship with this record interesting, because I heard a couple times before today I found out from Saoirse that it was all a fiction. I find that funny because if Saoirse hadn't brought that up, I would be learning it right now, which would have made this very interesting. But it definitely adds these additional elements to the kind of metafiction of the record that make it even more interesting. I like the idea, the sort of conceptual idea behind it of like wanting to see how people would respond to this kind of mythic, making a man a myth, that thing. I think that's really, really interesting, and I find the storytelling quite immersive and great. Like there's some great writing here. But yeah, it is a very scrappy album as well, and it has a certain kind of style that manic style to it that doesn't always land for me. It kind of feels a bit wearying at certain points. That said, I think that there's a wistfulness to the sort of closing stretch of this record that I really like. It kind of matures a little bit. And I was also very amused to learn that another one of my favorite songs on this record, I Love You Like an Alcoholic, saw a spike in popularity a couple of years ago, apparently, when it became a TikTok meme. So
what?
Apparently.
And I figured this out through like I figured this out too because of like the immense difference in stream counts on Spotify and YouTube that song has in comparison to the rest of the album. Like the song, like average for this album on YouTube and Spotify is like 50,000, I want to say, and then that song has about 5.5 million.
Oh wow. Wow.
Yeah, that's
okay.
That's where we're playing.
And it's a great song. I'm glad it's found an audience. It just what?
It's a great example.
I mean, I just
great example of how TikTok and this sort of social media platform can pluck these old pieces of music from obscurity. It reminds me exactly of the way that TikTok led to a resurgence in popularity of the one-time great Scottish indie rock band Life Without Buildings, who I've talked about on this podcast before, who put out one album like 20 years ago that became a cult classic. And then all of a sudden, I don't know how it happened, but one of their songs ended up being a TikTok audio thing, and they just blew up again, despite not putting any music out in 18 years. And this is a sort of not quite the same thing, but a sort of similar situation of how obscure this curio can exist in obscurity, and in the context of the record is quite significant and meaningful song, right? But then it becomes this entirely new and divorced thing through the internet, which I'm surprised, Saoirse, you didn't seem to know that, because I thought that might have been part of what is so interesting about talking about this record. But
well, I found this record because when I was like 18, I would just, as I'm sure you would imagine, obsessively just going through like folk punk playlists on YouTube, and I came across Some Rotten Man, which is a penultimate track on this, and fell in love with it, which is how I found the album.
Yeah. No, that's another one of my absolute favorite songs.
Yep.
That could be my favorite, actually. Thinking on it, that's a beautiful song. It's again, that wistfulness of it is there, that sort of sense of reflection. I like the way that, again, throughout this album, you get shifts in perspective from people within the story of Henry, whether it's Henry himself or others, to this kind of meta aspect of the narrator reflecting on the story itself and his relationship, ostensible relationship to this fictional character. That whole dynamic of it is fucking fascinating.
Yeah, so like the way the album is framed is the lead singer has befriended this sort of strange, weird drifter. He's transcribing all the stories this drifter has told him into songs. I didn't know that when I heard Some Rotten Man for the first time. So I just thought that this was a really authentic folk punk ballad about a real story of somebody realizing their wife had already been buried without them being told, because they were a complete arse to the wife. And reckoning with what that actually means. And in the context of the whole story, when you know this is a concept record about a person, that moment takes on a special kind of poignancy for me when you learn the full arc of their life. And at the end, they are actually, despite the fact that the things they've done are kind of unforgivable, especially when you've read the book. It goes into detail about the domestic abuse, and it's rough. But basically, when you get to that track at the end with those strange sort of almost like Hawaiian lead electric guitars, and that amazingly cathartic outro to the song where it really goes up another gear. It takes on a special kind of poignancy when you see the arc of this person's life and the terrible things they've done, but you actually see them reckon with it in a way that if someone hurts you, you never think of them actually thinking about the ways in which they've hurt you. But here is an example of someone doing it in a very authentic way.
Yeah, I just want to say, as another aside, another song I really like on this record is the track Weapon of God. And one of the reasons why I like it is that in writing, it feels like, maybe this is a cheap comparison, but it comes across like a really early Mountain Goats song, and just the way that it's written. The storm is a thunderous dark applause, and my love is locked in a pit bull's jaws. Believe me, I am a weapon of God too. Like, there's a real Daniel-esque quality to those lines. And that's just a really great song too, and it has a real sort of surge to it.
No, absolutely. So just to sort of cover the arc of the story very quickly. This guy whose grandfather dies the day they're born. That's referenced in the opening track. Basically grows up a bit, has this fling sort of shotgun wedding, finds his wife cheating on him and murders the person she was cheating on him with, and then beats her quite horribly, and then skips town, and he's homeless for a long time, and he gets a job in a steelwork plant, and this guy takes him in, lets him stay there. Turns out this guy's a drug dealer, and they all get wasted, and they find a dead body in the neighbor's house, and they call the police, and the guy who's a drug dealer gets arrested, and he's homeless again, And basically, he murders a businessman who, through his schizophrenic brain, he thinks is the devil. This is track 10 on the record at this point. After this time, he gets sent to an insane asylum that's very poorly run, so gets let out very, very soon. And after this point, he sort of finds peace in befriending the local punks of the town he's in. And that's sort of how the book ends.
Yeah, I can't say I picked up on a lot of the narrative nuance there from the album itself. Maybe it's just because of how kind of breathlessly manic it is as well. But yeah, the broad strokes, I guess, are there thematically. Like, you definitely get a sense of Henry as this just really sort of troubled. He kind of looks like Charles Manson, if that album cover is a
it's
representation of him.
The same way.
This sense of like this bewildered, sort of potentially sort of schizophrenic figure of great sort of turbulence.
But the reason I wanted to pick it for a record club is because I think I've spent so long just thinking about the record. Part of why I loved it is the ambiguity around the verisimilitudinousness of it. And I've just spent a long time with it in my head. And I want to know how it's sort of affected other people.
It feels like it's an album that feels like it's telling a rather straightforward concept in about the most convoluted way possible. And I mean that both as a kind of, well, not really both, but neither as like a positive or negative aspect inherently, in that it is very interesting to listen to. It kind of describes the life of this character in a very roundabout way, where I think, and this is mostly just the album I'm talking about, because obviously I haven't read the associated book with this, which I do think, as an aside, that makes for a really interesting experiment to create a story that is essentially like a multimedia piece, where the story of Henry Turner is not just this album, it is also the book. And I think that's a fascinating ambition. And it kind of feels like a lot of what you're getting of this character is left, at least on the album front, is left up to you kind of filling in the gaps about him. And I think that I find that both very interesting and also frustrating, because on a track like Atlanta's Own, really kind of finding the meaning and personal significance of how crushing of a moment that is for Henry as a character, I find that very fascinating and interesting. But in the same breath, I find other parts of it leaving me a little distant from my understanding of the character. And I really don't know what it is specifically about a lot of it, but I just sometimes feel like, and this is really also down to when you, Saoirse, described a lot of what the book tells us about him, where I feel there's just a few too many gaps in the story of this character with just the music itself for me to engage with it on that level alone. I find
for me, I got like this not a narrative per se, but like an emotional tenor that I completely got in terms of like melancholy, looking back, and this sort of mirthful anarchy of youth kind of wasted in a very Mountain Goats way, in a very sort of we shall all be healed way. But then like reading the book was like an enriching thing. It wasn't like there was stuff I was missing from the record, but it enriched what I'd already found there with repeated listens, you know.
All right. Yeah, no.
But I do totally hear where you're coming from on that aspect.
Just building off of what August said, I also had some similar feelings towards the record. I think it's really, really great in fits and starts. I didn't find it as consistently excellent as I kind of wanted to. But that said, it's still very solid. The narrative itself is pretty interesting. especially when you're trying to piece it together. Um, I did enjoy it a fair bit.
How do you feel about the idea of releasing an album about this kind of person and pretending it's totally real when this person is very horrible in many aspects? And how do you feel about releasing an album about a person and pretending he's real and trying to almost like ask for people to consider his humanity, I guess?
I think part of the point of it is that this person, regardless of whether or not the person is Henry Turner specifically, this person is real. Um, this is
Yeah.
obviously amplified for narrative, but people do shit like this guy does every single day. Um, it's in so many households, and so many people are actually like this. Um, and that, you know, if you ever encounter that in real life, you kind of have to humanize them because they're a person. That doesn't mean you should forgive them or try to see
Yeah.
where they're coming from. I think there's a really big difference between humanizing someone and forgiving them or, you know,
Yeah.
I think it's a level of understanding, and understanding doesn't always come with acceptance.
Yeah, I like to say as well, like I can't speak for what the tone of the book, obviously I haven't read it either, but I don't really feel that this record takes a particular kind of stance on Henry. It's just sort of really sort of depicting his life, and it's kind of a fascination with him. But I basically agree with everything that Morgan said, and I could see maybe why some people would be upset if it was like creating this fictional character, pretending that he's real, and then kind of like excoriating him and encouraging people to have this particular emotional response to him. But it's more just that it's just a story. It's just an exercise in the storytelling, and the meta aspect to it is part of the point of the whole exercise, and lends and does contribute to the kind of emotional response that I guess I and a lot of people probably have to the record and where it works, and it's all part of the exercise. And I think, yeah, it makes the record more interesting, and it makes the record stand out and be unique. And so that's only a good thing for it, I think.
And I think
Yeah,
it's
absolutely.
also really much to its benefit that it did not take a side explicitly, really. I mean, because, you know, it's either like preaching to the choir or co-signing really terrible shit. So there's not, I mean, there's not really much point in elaborating on domestic abuse is bad within the way that the story is told, because, like, duh.
Like I almost think of it in the same way as like again, it feels so weird to keep bringing it back to the Spanford talked about that I talk about a lot, but I think about the Sunset Tree a lot with this album, where it's like that's John Darnielle going out of his way to be very honest about what his stepfather did, and not, but only trying to see him as a person and not just a toxic memory. And I feel like this album does very similar things in that way.
I don't even really know if it's particularly because of the way it's written or even because of the way it sounds, but just the track "Drinking with Mickey Mantle" is one of the instances where it really conjures up a very like vivid scene where the whole lacking of a holistic character portrait of Henry in like a more linear sense that, like, I won't lie, I definitely share August's complaint in that regard where I like the idea of the multimedia thing. Obviously, I like Deadwing, but Deadwing was one of those things where it was like, yeah, we're not giving you the whole story, but we're giving you enough to be able to get everything you want out of this part of the experience, even if you don't look into everything. Like you can enjoy Deadwing without knowing everything about it because, well, I mean, that's kind of how it works because we don't know everything. Whereas this, I feel like if I did read the book, perhaps it would have enhanced my opinion of it overall. But this particular track specifically, um, confession is that I am a kind of a baseball nut, so I really kind of appreciated a lot of the references that were scattered across this entire album. I found them incredibly charming, including but not limited to the split finger fastball reference in this particular song, which is the first pitch I ever learned how to throw. And I was just kind of like, oh, hey, wow, childhood memories. And maybe it was that because it sort of evokes him in his childhood and talking about him playing baseball, and how his father actually went and drank and talked with famous baseball player Mickey Mantle, who was a fucking legend. And you just sort of get this sense of forlorn nostalgia that I think the record really taps into a deep sense of in its best moments. And I will say, I think the thing that keeps it going is the fact that it is a pretty brisk 37-ish minutes, and the sort of spry, raucous, folk punky vibe is maintained through, even when it's a little bit more low-key on that second half. To me, it's still really compelling instrumentally by the usage of the horns throughout. I really found that really captivating, and I also like that there's multiple singers on this album. It made this an incredibly easy album to digest musically, and I enjoyed it on that front. It was just something that I wanted a little bit more out of, but in that respect, it's kind of just, yeah, it's just kind of mincing words on, like, it's pretty great, all things considered. I just, like, could have been like a classic for me if it just maybe bridged that gap a little bit more. But, probably that wasn't the intent of the project itself, but it was definitely worthwhile, and I'm very glad I listened to it.
I do want to address something you mentioned, which is like the sonic palette a bit, which we've sort of touched on. But for me, I consume fuck tons of folk punk, as you all know. And I cannot think of another album in that rubric that sounds anything like this, especially in its jazzier, trumpetier moments. I find that sort of incredibly exciting. And I always find when albums in this genre take new sonic approaches to the material to be a breath of fresh air, especially when it's as well thought out structurally as this album is. And I just want to know if any of you guys have any thoughts as to whether that enhances the experience or not.
Oh, I mean, definitely. I think that, like, again, I didn't make that complaint, or not complaint, observation earlier with any amount of like slyness when I compared it to Tom Waits' Blood Money. I think that these two albums are incredibly
I
close to compare.
Black Rider a lot, actually.
Yeah, but Black Rider is also totally like the carnivalness, but like I think that Blood Money is also sort of like, instead of painting the portrait of a character, it kind of paints the portrait of a world and an environment. And that's kind of why that album, having a very, very similar approach to this one, works a little bit more for me, is that I feel like you're sort of immersed in a very specific setting rather than trying to get to know a character who you might feel a bit of a distance with. But in terms of just like the sonic palette, even though it is comparable to one thing, it is still incredibly unique. And it's like, of the folk punk albums I have heard, this is definitely like one of the more blistering and kind of chaotic. So I definitely appreciate that. It's definitely in keeping with what I think it's going for. So I definitely enjoyed that.
Yeah, well, overall, a very fascinating, multi-layered, and curious album that, I mean, for the complaints I've levied, I'm still not really 100% sure where I fall on this album overall. But to me, like, the interest of this discussion is less about like whether we like the album or not, and just kind of, like you say, what we think of the ideas it presents. So yeah,
on a conceptual level, it's very fascinating.
Yeah. Totally.
Yeah. Before we wrap up, I just want to read a very short thing from the author's note at the end of the book, right? I've had people ask me how much of it is true. The questions would range from, how well did you know Henry, to did Henry Turner even exist? I've never held much stock in the virtues of objective truth, especially in regards to good storytelling. When you paint something in the black and white of fact and fiction, you lose some of the magic. It's like the off-screen monster in horror movies. It's no longer scary when you've seen what the monster looks like. I think that, and that captures what I've always loved about the record, and its ambiguity. I just want to say, although the Taxpayers haven't released a record in like 5 years, the lead singer released a side project this year, an album called Storm Transmissions that I haven't listened to, but I will talk about next week.
Fantastic. Well, let us know at home what you think of this record. Well, first of all, we need to give our favorite tracks and ratings as well.
Yeah.
Jake, why don't you go first?
3 favorite tracks: Drinking with Mickey Mansell, Some Rotten Man, and I Love You Like an Alcoholic. Also want to shout out Weapon of God, just because that is a fucking great ass song. Least favorite track, what? Who the fuck was that?
Sorry.
Oh.
What happened?
I'll say that there's no real identifiable weak point on here, so I'll say that my least favorite's the one I remember the least about, which would be Jimmy Bartlett's Teeth. I give the album a 7 out of 10.
All right, cool. Favorites, As the Sun Beat Down, I Love You Like an Alcoholic, and Atlanta's Own. Least favorite is Raised in the Shadows. I give it a 6 out of 10.
My 3 favorites are I Love You Like an Alcoholic, As the Sun Beat Down, and Atlanta's Own. Least favorite, I'm actually going to say Weapon of God does not do much for me. It reminds me of certain Deer Hunter tracks off of the Acts 1 through 5 albums, and I'm just like, damn, those are better.
Shit.
I will give this a 7 out of 10.
My favorite tracks are Some Rotten Man, Nobody's Savior, I Love You Like an Alcoholic, and I'm gonna say it's the Sun Beats, and I'm gonna give the record a 9.5 out of 10.
My 3 favorite tracks are Atlanta's Own, I Love You Like an Alcoholic, and Some Rotten Man. My least favorite track is actually, I do not care for the closer here, Let the Seconds Do Their Worst. And the reason for that is that I always felt like I always thought when I first listened to this record that the kind of like interview snippet thing at the end just felt off for some reason. I couldn't figure it out. And now that I know that this is a fictional story, I can tell that the reason is that the acting is really hokey. And just not very convincing. And I just think that I kind of like the idea of the interview snippet as a closer, like it's this thing in new perspective. Since the record has like all these different perspectives, but it just doesn't really work.
I remember you was conflicted.
Yeah, it just doesn't really work for me.
I would not be surprised if it was the band members themselves. So yeah, I'm not sure.
Misusing your influence.
The evils of Lucy was all around you.
Stop.
This is the only time those 2 records will ever be connected.
Yeah. But yeah, I dig it enough. Give it a 7.
That's a 7.3 average. So we've got Basehead, Plays with Toys, Russ and Kelly, Shape and Destroy, and XTC, English Settlement.
Good company.
Sick.
Sounds about right.
All right. Well, let us know if this is an album that is important to you. Let us know what you think about it in the comments below. Let us know what you think about our conversation, if we missed any important aspects of the record, or if there's anything else.
If you're a fan of this record, the Taxpayers just reissued a load of their albums. This included. I got this in that reissue. So look out for that.
Be hilarious if they committed tax fraud.
Wouldn't it?
Why is tax fraud always so funny?
I don't know. It always is.
But yeah, let us know, as
Wesley
always.
Snipes. Sorry.
August, why don't you send us out?
All right. Well, as always, folks, rock over London, rock on Chicago, Harley Davidson, all for freedom, freedom for all.
It's a free ride. We've already paid.
Stop. Don't.